Hello, everyone, and welcome to Land Matters, the podcast of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. I'm your host, Anthony Flint. In this episode, we're going to consider the case of one city situated almost exactly in the middle of two very successful metropolitan areas, Boston and New York, and a place that would very much like to join in on that action. That's Hartford, Connecticut. With a population of about 125,000, nearly 1 million including the communities all around it, Hartford is the state capital and the fourth largest city in the Nutmeg State, behind Bridgeport, New Haven, and Stamford. It's one of the oldest cities in the Republic, founded way back in 1635. A couple of interesting notes: it's a city of many firsts, the nation's oldest public art museum, that's the Wadsworth Athenaeum, the oldest publicly funded park, Bushnell Park, and the oldest continuously published newspaper, the Hartford Courant. Mark Twain was among its famous residents. Early on, Hartford was a place of amazing innovation and a center of commerce. The insurance industry was basically born there in the early 19th century. Lots of inventions in manufacturing, firearms, typewriters, tools, sewing machines, bicycles, and even one of the nation's first electric cars. In the 20th century, Hartford became fancifully known as the nation's filing cabinet because it was the corporate headquarters for various insurance companies and a fairly major financial and banking center. But Hartford is a classic post-industrial city mostly these days, confronting decline even as other places have been booming. Hard times hit hard after World War II and through the 1990s. Loss of population, loss of all that manufacturing. Like so many other medium-sized legacy cities, whether it's Youngstown, Ohio, or Syracuse, New York. Adding insult to injury was turmoil and restructuring in the finance and insurance industries. The Aetna Insurance Company, an important symbol of commerce and a big employer, announced it would decamp for New York City, although more recently promised to stick around a little longer. Real estate caved in, property tax revenue, which is the foundation of any city's municipal fiscal health, declined, just as the need for more services increased. The original G. Fox and Company department store closed. The beloved Hartford Whalers hockey team left town. Downtown became desolate. Despite 11 years of economic expansion elsewhere in the nation, unemployment remained stubbornly high in the area, 11% at last check. So Hartford was on the brink of bankruptcy, avoided by a multilateral deal involving the state, unions, and philanthropies. But the entire state of Connecticut is struggling right now. It has a big pension problem and major fiscal woes, and big companies like General Electric, which was in Fairfield County, are like Aetna leaving. So if Hartford is going to find a way out of all these challenges, it seems clear it's going to have to do it mostly on its own. Joining me to talk about all this is someone who's been working hard at revitalization, using a number of tools and practices that we're going to talk about in a moment, Sara Bronin, architect, attorney, professor, and chair of Hartford's Planning and Zoning Commission. Sara, thank you for being part of the Land Matters podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I'd like to start with a little more background on how Hartford got to where it is at this point. Just as a personal aside, I have fond memories of the city. I grew up in Connecticut, and my first newspaper job was there in nearby Torrington. I used to cover the state capitol. These days, I am a frequent visitor from Boston, and when you drive down the highway from the northeast, you come around a bend and there's the majestic skyline. Now, as we know, a lot of cities have been going through challenging times, but in terms of recent history, and before we get into all the new exciting stuff that you've been working on, what happened in Hartford? Was it structural or bad luck or some combination? Can you walk us through some of the recent history?
Yeah, you've given us a great history looking back for actually a couple hundred years in your timeline about the transitions that Hartford has made throughout the course of its existence, nearly 400 years, as you point out. I would say that, over the 20th century, Hartford's story is very typical of post-industrial cities across the country. You have, as you explained, incredible, still existing architectural history of industry all over the city. We have giant buildings that used to be centers of creation and commerce. And in a lot of cases, some of those have been rehabilitated. In other cases, they're still sitting empty, waiting for a new life. So you see that aspect of Hartford. Of course, you have the population decline that you described. At its peak, Hartford had maybe 175, 180,000 people. It now has about 125,000 people. So we're a city that just 18 square miles, a city that used to be able to boast a much larger population than it has today. And so the flight out to our suburban areas is something that really has significantly changed Hartford. In addition, as you point out, there's a concentration of poverty within the city that has challenged Hartford's ability to provide the services needed by many of our residents. And, of course, providing services to our population takes resources, it takes creativity, it takes persistence, and Hartford is beset with some structural challenges that are really, again, as you pointed out, a problem across Connecticut in terms of the way that its cities are funded and in terms of the way that our tax structure is set up. We don't have regional governance in Connecticut. We don't really even have a regional mentality. We have 169 towns, and each and every one of them believes that they're distinct and should be distinctly governed. That feeling may have to be subordinated to broader concerns as we continue to see Connecticut facing challenges as a state as a whole, especially in comparison with other states. So we hope that some of that individual go-it-alone mentality that we've seen in the state of Connecticut will start to erode, but that'll really have to happen with some bigger picture regional thinking that's embraced by not only the people in our city and the cities across Connecticut, but in people in the suburbs and the small towns as well.
And just a quick note, because cities rely on the property tax so much, you've also got a number of nonprofit institutions, which is a great thing, but they're not producing that property tax revenue. Is that correct?
So over 50% of Hartford's property is non-taxable. So that includes the many buildings that we have here that belong to the state and federal government, of course, city buildings and schools as well. We also have, as you said, a large number of nonprofits. That includes hospitals as well as several colleges and universities. Now, all of these resources add tremendous value to our community, but one thing that they typically don't add is paying their full freight in terms of property taxes. So it's a challenge for Hartford to try to grapple with the need for these services and the benefits that they bring against the bottom line impact on the city's accounting and finances.
In terms of orchestrating any kind of comeback, the city, and this includes well before your time, has tried a number of things, some fairly standard economic development, pump priming, a science center, a convention center and hotel. By the way, Hartford almost became home to the New England Patriots, but the team withdrew a stadium proposal and chose to stay in Foxborough, Mass. As a Patriots fan, I can't say I'm unhappy about that. You do have a minor league baseball team, the Hartford Yard Goats. But tell us about what's going on right now, which strikes a lot of people as a bit more out of the box or perhaps a little unconventional. And I mean here the sweeping zoning reforms, breaking down regulatory barriers, encouraging things like the adaptive reuse of those historic buildings for maker spaces and craft breweries and the like. What are the key ingredients of all those changes and what kind of impact are they having?
So in light of the city's structural challenges in terms of how it gets taxes and how it relates to the state, we've really felt within the city that we have to take matters into our own hands in a way. And what we have to do is plan for and try to create a city that is vibrant and unique and try to do that through facilitating the kinds of investments that we think would be required to do that, including real estate investments, and also to create a buzz in Hartford that things are moving in the right direction. So as you point out, one of the ways that we tried to do this was a complete overhaul of our zoning code, and that really happened, the bulk of that in 2016, when we threw out a 50-year-old, very outdated zoning code and brought in a new zoning code. And in the zoning code, the reason that a zoning code is important, I should say first, is that the zoning code dictates everything that is built in the city, and it also dictates the way that those things are built in the city. So it does, of course, set out land uses, where the offices can be, where the residential can be, where maker spaces can be. But it also creates a framework for thinking about the city in a much more forward-looking way. So a traditional zoning code will separate uses. Our zoning code adds to that regulation of uses by creating a form-based code that addresses the form of the buildings. And so what we're saying through the form-based code is we want for the people who are coming in to build buildings and develop in the city to create development that people of Hartford want to see and describe very precisely what kind of development that is, whether it's an 8-story building downtown or a 2-story building in our neighborhoods, how far it's set back from the street, what kinds of tree canopy coverage might be required, how much of any particular property might be paved over or have a building on it. So all of those things are encompassed in the form-based code. In exchange for our setting out this very specific criteria, we've made it very easy for people to get their projects approved if they meet those criteria. So if you're a developer coming into the city and you say, I want to build an apartment building, we've told you in the zoning code exactly how we want that to be, and you can get a fast-track approval through the city without even coming to the Planning and Zoning Commission, which I chair. The other thing we've tried to do in the zoning code is really push for creative uses and to push for sustainability. On the creative uses front, you mentioned maker spaces. These are places where people make things. So you've just told us about Hartford's manufacturing history. We have a really amazing history here, from bikes to gold leaf to, as you said, the electric car. We should revive that manufacturing spirit here, and we're doing it on a small scale now. We're doing it with the craft breweries, with the distilleries, with places where people are making everything from jeans to boots. But we have to continue on that effort and start to grow the community of small-time craftspeople and really foster that, and that's what the zoning code is the first step in doing. The other thing that the zoning code is trying to do is to advance sustainability. So we've done everything from allowing wind and solar in every zoning district to requiring bike parking where we used to require car parking, to requiring trees to be planted in greater numbers than we ever have before. We're trying to encompass all measures of sustainability in the zoning code. And in making these requirements through the zoning code, we're making a statement about the kind of city we think Hartford should be.
Now, we talk about zoning and people's eyes might glaze over, but it's really the nuts and bolts that makes a big difference. So I understand that there was a lot of bureaucratic red tape and different rules and requirements. I believe different rules for factories making rice versus vermicelli. Is that right?
That's right. We had a zoning code use table that was 63 pages long, and I've had some attorneys in town tell me that the old zoning code put their kids through college because it was so complicated and so impossible for their clients to understand how they might develop in the city. The use table that sets out the uses that can be built in any zoning district now is 3 pages long. So we went from 63 pages to 3 pages through the zoning code reforms. Again, what that does is it makes it easier for people to understand what's expected in Hartford, but it also simplifies the process, which in turn reduces the cost of development.
Yeah, and a lot of progressive stuff. We don't have to spend a lot of time on it, but just take parking requirements. Most people don't understand the requirements under a lot of old codes call for sometimes as much as 2 or even 3 parking spaces per unit in new residential development. So you got rid of that. That reduces costs. It also, by the way, recognizes that people are getting around in different ways and not just driving their cars.
So we were the first city in the country, over about 100,000 people, to completely eliminate minimum parking requirements in the zoning code. And we did that for several reasons. First, because Hartford is a city that has far more parking supply than parking demand. In the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we tore down a lot of buildings and created a lot of surface parking lots, including in our downtown, but also in our neighborhoods and on our neighborhood commercial corridors. We've realized today that all of those surface parking lots reduce the quality of our public sphere and also show people that we've prioritized cars over people in the past. So the second big reason that we've adopted the parking reforms is to change that perspective, to tell people we're not requiring any developer, any property owner in the city to have cars on site as a traditional zoning code might. And in doing that, we really are trying to influence views and also to actually reduce demand. My colleague at UConn, engineering professor Norman Garrick, and his various PhD students that have come through his program, including another professor, Chris McCahill, have studied the issue of parking supply and demand, and both of them have concluded that the more parking you provide, the more likely it is that people are going to drive their cars. So if we're providing less parking, we are probably reducing the incidence of people driving their cars into the city. That, we hope, will help the pedestrian and biking culture that's already here in the city to flourish.
Now, because the art of urban planning is near and dear to all of us at the Lincoln Institute, I want to ask you about two things. Stepping back for a bit, there's a comprehensive planning process that's underway, and so I hope you could tell us a little bit about that. And also scenario planning. You were kind enough to come and speak at a scenario planning workshop we put on with the Capital Region Council of Governments. Recently, scenario planning is all about making multiple projections into the future to keep things from being set in stone, allow more flexibility before moving ahead with big physical interventions, for example, like a highway. So two things. First, the comprehensive planning effort, and then second, whether you think scenario planning can really help a place like Hartford.
So the city has embarked on a comprehensive city plan effort that will hopefully be completed in the spring. We've been getting a lot of input from people across the city. About 900 people have participated in about 31 meetings that we've done so far. And I've been at all of those meetings, and they've been really interesting and very informative. Together, we're trying to craft a vision for the city for its 400th birthday. And as you noted earlier in the conversation, that will happen in 2035. So it's just 15 years from the date of the anticipated adoption of the plan. That means we'll have 15 years to get from where we are today to where we want Hartford to be on its 400th anniversary. In the city planning process, we're considering a wide range of issues, including economic development, sustainability, transportation, arts and culture, as well as the basic livability issues that make a city great. One of the things that we've heard throughout the process is that people want Hartford to be vibrant and thriving, and that people see arts and culture, places like the Wadsworth Athenaeum that you mentioned, but also places within our neighborhoods where arts and culture thrives, as being central to Hartford's transformation. So through the planning process, we really hope to take that idea and take that strong sense that we've gotten across these 31 meetings, across these hundreds and hundreds of people that have provided input, and make it into something that we can make a vision for the whole city to share. Scenario planning will play a part of this. So you mentioned highways. One big issue that our plan is going to have to grapple with is what we do with Interstate 84, which bisects the city and, like many highways built in the same era, destroyed neighborhoods, separated parts of the city, and added a burden to the city in terms of air pollution and car traffic that we're still experiencing today. There's been a team working on a reconstruction or a re-envisioning of I-84. Various scenarios have been put on the table that include tunneling, that include lowering, that include part lowering and part decking, possibly partial tunneling. So a lot of different scenarios have been placed on the table for this I-84 project. Each scenario has significant implications on the city and vary in their levels of success in helping us weave the city back together. So when you're thinking about scenario planning, your highway example is a perfect one, because we have to think about what happens if federal and state decision makers go with one proposal. What happens if they go with another proposal? What should the city of Hartford's position be when considering all of the proposals? Right now, we think they're going for a lowered approach, but other options may be on the table as the design becomes more clear and then the funding attached to it becomes more clear.
Yeah, it really makes you wish that the planners of the urban renewal era had done a little bit more scenario planning and thought more about the long-term consequences. The highway does run pretty much right through downtown, and it's really been a nagging problem, hasn't it, to rebuild. Part of the problem, just by way of background, is that a portion of the elevated highway is deteriorating. It's reached the end of its lifespan, and so it has to be rebuilt or reconfigured in some way in terms of safety and to keep cars moving through the area. But just to pick up on that, there's another interesting idea, and that's to get rid of the interstate altogether. I wonder if you could comment on that. It sounds like a radical proposal, but actually a bunch of other cities have done it. San Francisco, Portland, Milwaukee, Rochester, New York City at the Sheraton Expressway. And the idea here, and this has been promoted by the Congress for the new urbanism, among others, is you actually, in these downtown freeways that have been so destructive, you actually replace it with surface boulevards. Is that idea getting any traction in Hartford?
So the cities that have successfully removed highways have really done something very daring. It's something that cities across the country would never have conceived of 20, 30, 40 years ago. Our urge back then, of course, was to build highways and then also to widen them, to make them wider, in the flawed theory that that would actually solve our traffic problems. Here in Hartford, the leadership behind the I-84 project has looked primarily at replacing the highway as a highway in some form or fashion. But I think that our city plan is giving us the opportunity to revisit that conversation or that approach, because we've seen, even nearby in Syracuse and in New Haven as well, situations where removal of highways has done far more for the community than their reconstruction. For the last few years in the I-84 planning process, we've taken a somewhat conservative approach, and by we I mean primarily the state Department of Transportation, and that conservative approach has been looking at rebuilding the highway. But through the city planning process and through more conversation, I do think it's probably time to think about whether we should be rebuilding it in place at all. And again, as you say, that might be a radical approach, but it is something we should think about seriously as we've seen more and more cities become successful in their highway removal projects.
There's also this idea of somehow better tying into your commuter rail or your rail service, as well as the bus rapid transit system called Connecticut Fast Track, or CT Fast Track, I believe. That has been a pretty good experiment. And there's another proposal that's pretty wild that's out there coming out of the University of Pennsylvania, and Robert Yarrow, who is the former president of the Regional Plan Association. And that has to do with a ambitious rerouting of the Acela high-speed rail line between New York City and Boston, which currently goes from New Haven through Connecticut and Providence and on to Boston. This proposal would put the high-speed rail route from New Haven to Hartford, onto Springfield, over to Worcester, and then to Boston. And that would certainly put Hartford in the center of what some planners call a mega region in the Northeast, and potentially turn it into a central spot in terms of the housing and labor markets. It was inspired, by the way, in part by something called the Northern Powerhouse Initiative, which is in the UK. That involved a number of big investments in some similar cities, like Manchester, that are in many ways similar to New Haven or Hartford or Springfield. So that's how they dealt with older post-industrial cities and kind of brought them into a larger regional economy. So it sounds kind of crazy, but what do you think of that idea of putting high-speed rail through Hartford and making Hartford part of, a larger mega region?
I think a lot of people in our community would strongly support the idea of increasing rail service to Hartford, whether it's services we have now or a high-speed rail. The high-speed rail, of course, provides unique opportunities to expand our workforce and to move people in and out of the city and to put us on the map, quite literally, in the context of this broader mega region that you talk about. Our relationship with Boston, our relationship with New York, already exists, at least when it comes to economic relationships, because of the kinds of companies that are headquartered here and the business sectors that they represent, whether that's the financial sector, the insurance sector, or advanced manufacturing, which is increasingly important. So we do see high-speed rail as a huge potential advantage for Hartford. And the real question would be, who's paying for it and how do we build it? And how do we build it fast? Because Hartford can't wait for a 50-year project. We need to make major transportation improvements now. And I think that's one of the big keys to Hartford's future.
Yeah, and potentially there's a real role for places like Hartford. New York City and Boston, very expensive places. This is potentially, the city is an alternative in terms of housing. If people could just get between these major cities faster, like they do in Europe or Asia, these cities that are relatively close together, isn't Hartford just about 100 miles exactly from Boston and 100 miles from New York City?
You might be right.
So if there was a way to reduce travel times between those places, all kinds of economic development benefits might flow.
Yep, you're almost exactly right. It's 100 miles between Hartford and Boston and 117 between New York and Hartford.
Yeah, it is right smack in the center. So we've reached the end of our time. Scenario planning, zoning reform, mega regions, infrastructure. Only here at the Land Matters podcast could we look at all these things that are in the mix. Wish you the best of luck in the city's continued efforts in regeneration. And Sara Bronin, thank you for this conversation.
Thanks a lot.
Well, you can check out much more about legacy cities and scenario planning and financing infrastructure at the Lincoln Institute website. Just go to lincolninst.edu. And don't forget to follow us on Twitter. We're at @landpolicy. For more reading as well, go to the Atlantic City Lab for a new article on all of Hartford's efforts and the challenge of dealing with that interstate highway viaduct. We hope you'll keep tuning in for Land Matters, the podcast of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. I'm your host, Anthony Flint. Thanks for listening. We're finding answers in land.